Good morning. This is Haskell Hall in the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer on Tech Drive in Ruston, Lincoln Parish, Louisiana, in the United States. And our web page is rustonredeemer.org. Today is the 7th out of 9 in this series on the sacraments. And of course, we're talking about the sacraments, but we also are talking about, certainly in our 9th session on June 30th, we're also talking about how the Episcopal Church is structured. And you'll learn that word, that wonderful word, polity. Polity, not politics, but polity is how churches are governed and structured. And so I'll tell you about the government and structure of the Episcopal Church. In other words, our polity. And next week on June 23rd, we'll deal with the ministry of everybody and also the ministry of ordained persons. And we have 3 kinds of ordination: bishops, priests, and deacons. And I have been ordained as a deacon and as a priest. And today we're dealing with marriage, and also we're dealing with, to use a technical term, the dissolution of marriage. Namely, what happens when a marriage goes kablooey. Bishop Owensby will make his visit on August the 11th. That Sunday, we will have one service that day at 10:30. And then on August the 4th, I'll be on vacation on Lake Ouachita in Arkansas with my Arkansas and Louisiana families. And so it'll be fun. In the Episcopal Church, in the Episcopal Church, we have the Articles of Religion. And the 39 Articles of Religion, as they are called, state categorically that there are only 2 sacraments that were ordained by Jesus. And that is the baptism and the Holy Eucharist. And so in this Book of Common Prayer, we have sort of threaded the needle carefully, and we refer to the other 5 commonly called sacraments, as the 39 Articles call them. We refer to those 5 commonly called sacraments as sacramental rites. By the way, the rite is the text of a liturgical service. And the 5 sacramental rites, as they are called by this prayer book, of course, we have talked about confirmation, and we've talked about, last week we talked about the anointing of the sick, which I do on a very regular basis. We talk about the reconciliation of a penitent. And then next week we will talk about the meaning of ordination. And then today we're dealing with marriage. One of the things that is important to remember is that despite what is said in the papal document, Dominus Jesus, we are not an ecclesial community, we are a church. And as a church, that means that we very legitimately and necessarily determine who receives the sacraments and who is admitted to the sacraments and who is admitted to celebrate the sacraments or preside at the sacraments. And so all the sacraments, including the sacramental rites, they are and must be regulated and administered by the church. That means that not anybody can do them. And in the Episcopal Church, as in other churches, there is a legal system. In the Episcopal Church, we have something called the Constitution of the Church, which we rarely tinker with. And then we have the canons of the Church, of the National Church, and we deal with them every General Convention. And then each diocese has a constitution and canons. So that means that how we deal with marriage and ordination and confirmation, the canons about ordination determine who can be ordained and what are the requirements for ordination. And of course, one of the things that takes place at the beginning, just about the beginning of an ordination service, either for a deacon or a priest or a bishop, is that you say, "I, Frank Whit Hughes, do solemnly swear that I do believe the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament Testaments to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary for salvation. And then the next sentence is very important. And I do solemnly engage to conform to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of the Episcopal Church. And so you always had to take the oath of conformity. But in this prayer book of 1979, taking and signing the oath of conformity is now part of it's part of the service itself of ordination. But you always had to take it and sign it in the presence of the bishop. But now you take and sign the oath of conformity, you read it aloud, everyone hears you read it, everyone sees that you sign it. When a bishop is ordained, the bishop being ordained takes it and signs it, and then the other consecrating bishops who have seen the new bishop take it and sign it, they also sign it as witnesses. That's how important the oath of conformity is. And of course, it's important because to become a priest or a deacon or a bishop of the Episcopal Church, you're an officer of the church, and you can't be an officer of the church whose rules and regulations you disagree with, right? You have to say, well, maybe I don't like every one of them, but I'm going to abide by them. And so that's what we do when we sign the oath of conformity. And so that means that the canons and constitution and also the rubrics of the prayer book, the little directions in italics, are all important and are all enforceable. Now, let's talk about marriage. In order to have a valid marriage in the Episcopal Church, one of them, at least, must be a baptized Christian, okay? If neither of them are baptized Christian, then why do they want to get married in the church? I don't know. So one of them has to be married. It doesn't have to be in the Episcopal Church. And then the other thing is that when an adult, or especially two adults, either baptized or not, but normatively at least one is baptized and normatively both are baptized, when Christian adults take an oath publicly, in other words, will you love her and honor her and keep her in sickness and in health, the vows of marriage, right? We consider that vow is binding, and we consider that vow is to be considered sacred. And that includes the traditional vow of faithfulness in marriage. And so the presupposition that we have by giving people these oaths that they have to take, either the vows of baptism or the vows of confirmation or the vows of marriage or the vows of ordination, our presupposition is that if a properly informed adult of sound mind makes a vow, especially if it's made publicly, that adult can be reasonably expected to keep that vow, okay? Now, if you were to read the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 2 and following, you would see that Jesus was asked a question about divorce. And that was interesting because in Jewish tradition, divorce is allowed. In the Old Testament, divorce is allowed, believe it or not. And so Jewish tradition allowed and continues to allow divorce. And so if you get a divorce decree, if you're Orthodox Jewish and you get a divorce decree, it's written in Aramaic, I'm told, and it's called a get. However, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus, in contrast to Jewish tradition, the Jewish tradition he grew up in, Jesus in Mark chapter 10 forbids divorce absolutely, okay? And so Mark seems to be in favor of the husband. Again, Mark was written, Jesus was in the 1st century CE, and Mark was written in the late 1st century CE. And Jesus, as portrayed by Mark, is in favor of the husband as the major breadwinner of the family, continuing to support his wife, because Jesus says, if you divorce her, you cause her to commit adultery, see? And so the reason is if the wife does not have appropriate support, having raised a family and done all the things that wives do in the ancient world, the wife would become destitute and the wife would very likely fall into prostitution. And we believe that Mark was first of the three synoptic gospels. And so Matthew 19:3 and following is based on the Gospel of Mark chapter 10. It's based on the same passage in Mark. And the big difference is that in Matthew, while Mark 10 has Jesus forbidding divorce absolutely, Jesus in Matthew 19 allows divorce, but only on the grounds of adultery, only on the grounds of porneia. And if you commit porneia and you are married, it is adultery. It is a sin against a sin against the seventh commandment. And so this is found, a man who divorces his wife, except if there is porneia involved, sexual immorality, which is adultery, you cause that person to commit adultery. And so in view of what Jesus said, given that what Jesus said is so countercultural to our own current culture, in defense of Jesus' view of divorce, it can be said that a woman who no longer is supported by her husband might very well fall into prostitution in order to support herself and her children. And so a good way of understanding the prohibition of divorce by Jesus, you can see that very reasonably as Jesus' way of trying to protect the woman in the marriage. The woman in the marriage, even when the marriage doesn't last, Jesus seems to be trying to protect the woman in the marriage and also protect the children in the marriage. So the forbidding of divorce, the prohibition against divorce, which is not absolute in Matthew, you can see it very reasonably as a way of trying to uphold marriage and to try to uphold a husband and wife living together under the same roof, but also where there is mutual support. So divorce is a bad thing. And so sometimes the bad thing is the best that you can get. But Jesus was generally against divorce. And I believe that Mark was the first of the Gospels to be written. So I don't have a problem with believing that Jesus absolutely forbade divorce. And Matthew seems to be giving us the exception on the grounds of adultery. And so I believe that we can all agree that divorce between a married couple is not a good thing. And common sense and experience, however, tells most of us that sometimes human life is not all peaches and cream. Is that a good way of putting it? Sometimes human life is not all wonderful. And sometimes things that are intended to go very well indeed, such as your marriage, sometimes they do not go well. I don't think I need to say a lot more than that. But when I was in Philadelphia, there was a lady that lived in the rectory, and she had been married a long time, and she was in her 90s, Mrs. Bailey, Mom, and she lived in the rectory. And so one Saturday morning, we had lunch and something, and I said, well, Mrs. Bailey, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell a couple about getting married. And Mrs. Bailey told me, and she knew what she was talking about, she said, tell them it's a rocky road. I don't know that it's a rocky road, but it's sometimes a difficult road. And so I think that it's appropriate for the church to help people as best we can who have found their marriage to be a rocky road. And so, first of all, we try to do quality control on marriage. So if anyone wants to come to me on a Tuesday morning and says, I'd like to get married, and I say, when would you like to get married? And they say, today, then the short answer and the only answer is, I don't do marriages like that. Actually, I'm supposed to have 30 days notice, and I have to counsel them several times about what marriage is about. So if people want to get married on Tuesday, I'd like to get married today. I don't even bother to ask them if they've been married before, because I'm never going to do it. And so if you look at this piece of paper that I gave you, and at the top of the paper it says Canon 18. Now on the other side it says Canon 19, but let's look at Canon 18. And here is what happens. Section 1, I have to conform to the laws of the state, right? That means that the people who get married have to have a valid marriage license. If I marry people here in Louisiana, I have to have a marriage license. I have to have a marriage license that is issued by a parish clerk in the state of Louisiana, right? If I was in Texarkana and I was at St. James Church in Texarkana, Texas, I would have to have a marriage license from Bowie County, not Miller County, okay? So the state makes the laws about civil marriage. We in the church make the laws about Christian marriage. And so they have to notify me of their intent to marry at least 30 days prior to the solemnization, unless I know them and can vouch for them. And if I waive that 30-day requirement, I'm required by the Canon 18, Section 2, to report my action to the bishop in writing. And he might write me back and say, okay, Father Hughes, why did you do that? And I might have to write him back and say, well, I've known these people for 5 years, and therefore I believe that this marriage will succeed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if I do anything about marriage, I've got to, if I were asked about it by the bishop, I would have to say why I did what I did, okay? They have to be married according to the laws of the state. They have to know exactly who the other person is. They have to know that that other person has not been married before. That's one of the reasons of having a marriage license, because if you have a marriage license, you certify that you've been divorced before, that you have a valid divorce, or you've never been married before, and you have to bring in a birth certificate, etc. And then, if you look at Section 3C, both parties have been instructed by the member of the clergy or a person known by the member of the clergy, such as some other priest, to be competent and responsible in the nature, purpose, and meaning, as well as the rights, duties, and responsibilities of marriage. I have to be satisfied for myself that they know what they are getting into. By the way, in older prayer books, before there were necessarily marriage licenses given by the state, the priest had to publish the banns of marriage. I publish the banns of marriage of so-and-so of this parish. If any person knows any just cause where they may not be lawfully joined in holy matrimony, you are bidden to declare it. This is the first time of asking. And you do that of a Sunday, and then you do it one more Sunday. And that's what you did before there were marriage licenses. Having a marriage license, however, tells me that the state has determined that these people are canonically and legally free to marry, because I'm not allowed to marry people who are not legally free to marry, right? And so they have to sign the Declaration of Intention. And if you look down at Section 4, it says the Declaration of Intention. We understand the teaching of the church that God's purpose for our marriage is for our mutual joy, for the help and comfort we will give to each other in prosperity and adversity, and when it is God's will, for the gift and heritage of children and their nurture in the knowledge and love of God. We also understand that our marriage is to be unconditional. Like, we'll stay married unless she does blank. That would be conditional. Marriages have to be unconditional, mutual, exclusive, faithful, and lifelong. And we engage to make the utmost effort to accept these gifts and fulfill these duties with the help of God and the support of our community. And so when I marry people, I have to sign the marriage certificate. 2 witnesses have to sign, the bride and groom have to sign, and they have to sign the parish register too. And so it's recorded in the parish register or in the marriage register in the church. And I must do that. In some states, if I fail to sign the marriage license and send it to the county clerk, then I can be fined $50. How about that? So I've never had to pay that fine. So it's got to conform to the laws of the state, and it's got to be recorded. And so one of the things about marriage is that, is it a sacrament or not? Well, one of the things about sacraments is the sacraments are considered irreversible instances of God's grace. Since God gives us grace through the sacraments, God does not take back that grace. When God gives us grace, God's gift of grace to us is irreversible. See? That's why we don't baptize people again. And so under this theory, if Joe has a valid sacrament of marriage with Susie, in other words, Joe and Susie are married, and they have a valid sacrament of marriage with each other, while Susie is alive, traditionally, Joseph cannot enter into another valid sacrament of marriage with Violet while Susie is alive, because what would then happen to the valid sacrament of marriage that Joe had with Susie? See? You can't have a valid sacrament of marriage with two different people at the same time, okay? And so one of the things that you had to do before 1973, you had to have a dissolution of marriage. You had to get permission from the bishop to marry people again, because after all, Jesus forbids divorce, right? And so traditionally, the church did not recognize that there was such a thing as divorce. Why? Because will you honor and keep her in sickness and in health until we are parted by death? Remember the older words, until death do us part. So you are making a vow of marriage that is while both of you are living. See? When one of you is dead, then the vow of marriage, the marriage is over when one of you dies. And so you make a vow when you get married until we are parted by death. And so it was difficult to get remarried in the Episcopal Church. And if you happen to be a priest and you were in the Church of England, you were not going to get remarried in the church. And if you did get remarried in the church, if you did get remarried and you were a priest, then you would not continue to be a priest serving a church in the Church of England. And so we made the canon more pastoral and dealing with the reality of the dissolution of marriage. But there used to be a list of impediments. Like an impediment is the groom didn't know who the bride really was. The bride didn't know who the groom really was. The groom really thought in his heart of hearts, well, we're going to try it for a couple of years and then we'll quit if we need to. But the bride didn't know that, but the groom had that as his intention. So there were a number of impediments that would make a canonical marriage and a sacramental marriage not possible. And so we no longer have that list of impediments, but previously you had the list of impediments and you had to use one or more of those impediments when you wrote the bishop to get permission to marry people, one of whom or both of whom had been married before. And you might not get permission. I get news for you. And so the basic thing now under this Title I, Canon 19, you have to ascertain that the first marriage is legally over. And you have to see a copy of the divorce decree. And in some dioceses, you have to send the bishop a copy of the divorce decree. And in Pennsylvania, the Diocese of Pennsylvania, you had to show the bishop a copy of the divorce decree and swear that the divorce decree was made at least 30 days after the divorce became final. Because within 30 days, either party could contest the divorce. So anyway, you have to ascertain that the first marriage is legally finished and that the divorce decree is final and is legally valid. And then you have to talk with the couple, and you have to figure out that the couple knows what went wrong with the first marriage. If the first marriage went wrong, if it ended in divorce, each party in the intended marriage needs to know, and I don't mean just think, but know what went wrong with the first marriage. And so you have to make it clear that the people, if something went wrong, we have to kind of be clear that something went wrong, and then you have to be clear about the fact that you don't want that thing to go wrong in the next marriage, see? And so I have to determine that the couple firmly intends that this new marriage will be a lifelong union. And I have to believe that this new marriage that I'm going to solemnize, and I'm asking the bishop for permission to do so, this new marriage is in all likelihood going to succeed and be permanent. And then I have to get permission, and then in order to get permission, I have to tell the bishop that continuing care for the previous spouses and the children of the former marriages must be shown. You can't just cut off your first wife if she's poor and starving. You can't do that. And so you have to continue to care for the previous spouse and the children of the previous marriage. And then after the priest gets the permission from the bishop in writing, based on my request, the priest then reports to the bishop that I did marry so-and-so according to the permission given under Title I, Canon 19. And when I have sought permission to marry people who have been married previously, I have never yet been turned down by the bishop of a diocese. I guess there's always a first time, but I never have been turned down. And I've asked permission in several dioceses. Now, what about divorce? Well, what about marriage? I believe that people who have gone through a painful divorce, or even divorces, I believe that they have been punished enough. And I do not think that churches ought to punish them too. If you've gone through a bad divorce, if you've gone through a really painful marriage, whether or not you are at fault, I don't believe in punishing people. And a large percentage of divorces, I can tell you because I've done the Canon 19 petitions, a large percentage of divorces involve one or more marital partners where there has been abuse of alcohol or other drugs. And the younger the people who want to get married again, the more likely it's both alcohol and drugs, both. And we also know that a significant percentage of all marriages do end in divorce. I am told that the majority of marriages that are done in churches do not end in divorce. And so I think it's a good thing that we try to do some quality control before we marry people. Now, why do you celebrate the sacramental rite of marriage? I believe that if a man and a woman, or any two people that are getting married, if they intend to make a lifelong commitment to each other, and they do state that when they repeat those vows, they state that it is going to be lifelong. And they've also signed the declaration of intention that says it's lifelong. This is something that the church ought to celebrate and honor. I mean, people agreeing to live with each other for the rest of their lives, I think that's an amazing thing. It's not something I've ever done. If that intended lifelong commitment did not actually work out, after strenuous efforts to make it work, which I might do, or I might refer them to somebody who knows what they're doing about marriage counseling, I always believe that it's best to treat people with compassion and mercy. And I am very much convinced by reading Mark 10 and by reading Matthew 19 that this is what Jesus did. Jesus had a lot of compassion. And so that's my perspective on marriage and the dissolution of marriage. And, I really wish there was no such thing as divorce. I wish that all people who get married with each other would get along forever and love each other forever and ever and ever and raise wonderful kids and do everything they're supposed to do. But in the real world, I know that is not the case. And so I think it's the church's job to try to minister to and work with people who are, like me, imperfect. And so what questions do you have about marriage and divorce?
After doing ministry for decades.
What now?
After doing ministry for decades, looking into marriages throughout different parishes, what's one, or maybe a couple, defining characteristics of a lasting marriage?
Well, there are several parts of the rocky road, and one of the rockiest parts of the rocky road is money. The other is disagreements about raising kids. I think also, I'm assuming that there is differing opinions about marital relations. But the main thing is, does this man and does this woman, are they willing to really stick it out? Are they really willing to say, I'm imperfect, my spouse may be imperfect, and we're both imperfect, but nonetheless we live in an imperfect world, and we are determined that we are going to make our marriage as good as possible, even if all of the circumstances around us in our city and where we live, etc., even when there are all sorts of circumstances, like a kid is sick, even when circumstances are not favorable to our marriage, we're going to stay married. And so sometimes there are circumstances in either the kids' lives or either of the marital partners' lives, like a job goes bad, like the thing that the husband or the wife does, they no longer can make a living doing that, for example, like they were coal miners. So there are a lot of circumstances in different people's lives that impinge directly on the marriage. And the successful couples have to accept that fact and say, we know that there are these bad things that are going to happen to us or happen to some people. And given the fact that there are these bad things that happen, we're going to work together and try to make the bad thing maybe not so bad. And so if a couple is willing to work together and to acknowledge their own faults, each spouse is willing to acknowledge his or her own faults, as well as the faults of the spouse, and they're willing to give the other the benefit of a doubt, then the couple can work through anything, even infidelity, even deathly illness, even the death of a child, even the serious and continuing illness of a child. And one of the things that is really bad for marriages is interference from the in-laws. That's another big one right there. That's up there with money. So interference from mom and dad, that's frequently a bad thing. And so I don't have an opinion about that, except I've seen it. I have to instruct them in the nature, purpose, meaning, as well as the rights, duties, and responsibilities of marriage. And that covers premarital counseling. I actually give them a test. It's called the Premarriage Awareness Inventory, the PAI. And I give them the test, and they take the test, and then I look at it, and it sort of you compare their responses to a bunch of questions with each other. And then after a while, you get an idea. There's 6 or 8 categories: communication, children, money. There's about a dozen of those categories. And you can get the idea really quickly. Here are the areas of their marriage that they really are in good agreement on. And here are some areas down here where he says this and she says that, and they're not on the same page. So I actually give them their test, their PAI, and I said, here, and I go over it in red where they don't agree. And I say, here are the things that you guys need to work on before I marry you. And I've had almost all of the couples say this PAI was a good thing. So there is something that's very expensive, that's very fancy. It's called Prepare Enrich. And it's very, very expensive, and it's a little too rich for my blood, but it does it kind of in spades. It's much more complicated and much longer. And like every time you do it, you send it in, and the computer deals with it, and it's more than $100, and it's more than $1,000 to get trained to use it. But it's called Prepare Enrich, and I have no doubt that it's a really good thing. But I think the premarital awareness inventory is, to my way of thinking, it's a really good questionnaire, and it really gets at the nitty-gritty of the problem. So I think what I want to be is, I don't want to be intrusive. but I would like to be helpful. And sometimes when people want to get married and you are fairly convinced that this marriage, this can't work, you can either refuse to marry them, which I've never done, but you can refuse to marry them, or you can say, I think that you need to go to a relationship counselor, so-and-so, and here is one or two counselors that I know that are good. And you need to go to this relationship counselor and work on your relationship, especially on these areas. And if you do that, and if this counselor says that they're hunky-dory to get married, then I'll marry you. I've never actually done that, but that's what I would do. I'm a biblical scholar, as you know. I'm not a great pastoral counselor. There are people who do pastoral counseling that do it a lot better than me. And I can refer you to another priest that I know, and there are several around here that are very good, or I would go refer them to a counselor. And if there's something that they need to work on, then why not tell them before they get married that they need to work on it? Next week, we will deal with ministry and ordination. And we'll talk about lay ministry and we'll talk about ordained ministry. And so if you have any questions about what it is to be a priest or a deacon or a bishop, you can ask me, and I'll give you my opinion. And then our final session will be on the last Sunday of June, and that'll be about the structure of the Episcopal Church. What authority does a bishop have? What authority does the priest in charge of a parish have, etc. So you're getting the outlines of what it is to be an Episcopalian. All right. Well, if you have any questions during the week, don't fail to give me a call. I'll be here on Monday because we're having a vestry meeting. Thank you.